Welcome back to my channel, and thank you for joining us here again. This case has been requested by quite a few of you, so thank you very much for your suggestions and your messages. And if you have ever watched the trial or the sentencing of this case, you will know that there's so much footage and there's also a lot of information about this case, but that is why I'm here to summarize it all for you. So without any further ado, let's get into this case.
Intended for mature audiences only.
This case is quite complex in the sense that there are a lot of people involved and there's also a lot of aspects involved in this case. So with that being said, let me try and start from the beginning and try and describe some of the characters in this case so it kind of all links together. But this case takes place in Krugersdorp, which is in South Africa. Krugersdorp was originally set up as a mining town for all of the gold miners that were coming to the area. So let's start. So in 2007, a lady named Miranda Stain, who was 41 years old in 2007, was attending a church meeting where she was then introduced to a lady named Cecilia Stain. And Miranda and Cecilia are not related in any way, they just have the same surname. Cecilia was 24 years old at the time, and while Cecilia and Miranda were talking, Miranda then introduced Cecilia to her two children, LaRue, who was 10 at the time, and Marcel, who was 7 years old at the time. These two ladies being introduced was the start of something absolutely horrific, and Miranda and Cecilia's friendship would build over time and become a lot more complex and dangerous. They were introduced to each other by a lady named Ria, and Ria was quite high up in the church. She was not just a normal lady as part of the congregation. She would often give sermons, or she would talk to a lot of people, counsel a lot of the people who attended the church. So let's start with Cecilia. And Cecilia would later on describe how she had a very traumatic childhood. She said that she was often abused by close family members, and it was sadly in both a sexual and physical nature. However, Cecilia's mom and dad would say that she was a very chronic liar. She would often make up stories, and she would always want to be that kind of child that was better than you. So if you had a cut on your arm, if you had a bloody nose, Cecilia would go up to you and be like, actually, I have a bigger cut. I have a worse bloodier nose than you do. So she was that kind of kid. And Cecilia was also self-described as a very naughty child in school. She also said that she would often hit her teachers. But when Cecilia was 16 years old, she met a man who would later become her husband. They would also later have two children together. And after Cecilia and her husband left school, her husband became a police officer, which is a little ironic. Also later in life, Cecilia would claim to have a lot of health issues like high blood pressure, multiple personality disorder, just to name a few. So now that we've kind of described Cecilia, let's move on to Miranda. Miranda was a divorced mother of two. She was a high school teacher and described as a very good one, actually. She also described as a very quiet person, and she was also very kept to herself. Miranda's dad was a psychologist, and Miranda really had the knack for this kind of psychology and reading people and understanding people. But later on, it would become evident how obsessed with Cecilia Miranda was, and whatever Cecilia wanted Miranda to do, she would do. Miranda was literally that person that if Cecilia had to sneeze, there would be a tissue right there. If Cecilia had to say jump, Miranda would be that person who asked how high. Now remember, Miranda had two children, LaRue and Marcel. LaRue and Marcel were very close. They often played together. They weren't very far in age, so they had a lot of similarities growing up, but it was very clear from the start that LaRue was not Miranda's favorite child. The two children didn't have a very good relationship with their father until they were both adults. So before I continue with the story, Cecilia and Ria were actually very good friends, and there were rumors that they were actually lovers and that they shared a very intimate bond with each other, but Ria often denied this, and so did Cecilia. And in 2010, Ria, Cecilia, and Miranda would actually separate from their main church where they all met, and they then created their own church called the Overcomers Through Christ Church. So once this church started, they actually had a few members who joined them. So at first, the founders of this church was Ria, Miranda, and Cecilia, but then eventually a man named Zach Valentine joined the church. And Zach was an insurance broker, and he was very successful and quite wealthy. Zach had a girlfriend named Michaela, who he eventually married in 2010, and they became Mr. and Mrs. Zach Valentine. Michaela was very active in her church life. She would often also give sermons and sing at church, and she loved learning about things in the Bible as well. There were also another 2 members who joined the Overcomers Through Christ Church, and that was Natasha Berger and Joy Burnsier. Now, I know I'm throwing a lot of names at you, but they all become relevant later on in the story. Now, when Rhea was at her old church, she had a mentor who would help her with the Bible verses, who would help her write her sermons, and his name was Reginald Ben Dixon. And Reginald would also later leave his main church and then join Rhea at her Overcomers church. And Reginald and Rhea would work quite closely together because Reginald would often help Rhea create courses for the people in the church and just to help them and to teach them. And some say that this is kind of the reason that Cecilia and Rhea didn't really see eye to eye, because Cecilia wanted to write these courses and to teach people her ways, and Rhea was looking at Reginald for advice, and this is where the 2 really butt heads and where the relationship started to break down between Cecilia and Rhea. And this was definitely one of the catalysts that started the chaos between the 2, which sadly would kind of trickle into the lives of so many other people. But now we're going to fast forward to another 2 years. So this church and the creation of the church and all the members joined in 2010. Now we're going to fast forward to 2012, so 2 years later. So now the relationship between Rhea and Cecilia is absolutely tumultuous, to say the least. So remember I said earlier that there were rumors that Cecilia and Rhea were lovers. Like I said, they denied it, but there was obviously a very strong emotional bond between the 2. And I don't know if you've ever experienced a breakdown in friendship or even in a relationship, but when there is so much emotion, the love could often turn into hate and things could become very, very vile and very toxic very quickly. And that is exactly what happened between Cecilia and Rhea. So Cecilia now got closer between a lot of members in this Overcomers church, and she actually convinced a lot of them to leave their church and to start their own group. So Cecilia, Miranda, and her 2 children, Zach and his wife Michaela, all left the Overcomers Through Christ church, and they then started their own group called Electus per Deus, which means chosen by God. And every single member of this group had the words Electus per Deus tattooed somewhere on their body. They simply explained it to just be a group of friends that wanted the same name on them, like a lot of Christian churches would have, or sometimes people would have the crucifix tattooed on them or something like that. And they kind of were having now Electus per Deus tattooed on them. They just wanted to be different, and that's why they chose Electus per Deus. However, LaRue, later on during trial, would state that they were instructed by Cecilia to get several tattoos on their bodies, not only Electus per Deus, but several other tattoos on them to prove their commitment to Cecilia, because Cecilia wanted to make sure that they were completely over Rhea and that there was no connection to the Overcomers church anymore, and that they were completely dedicated to Cecilia. So like I said, now we're in 2012 and Cecilia absolutely hates Rhea, and now she decides that she is going to gun for every single person that Rhea loves, connected with, or any type of relationship. She's going to make sure that she guns for these people and destroys Rhea's life. Cecilia will definitely deny this later in trial, but that's the basis of the Krugersdorp killings. And for Rhea and a lot of people in the Overcomers church, bad things started to happen to them. For example, a pastor that Rhea was connected to and friends with in her old church had his car broken into, their church was almost burned down, and the pastor was held up by gunpoint. Natasha Berger, who remember was still part of the Overcomers church, she had her tires slashed on many occasions. Natasha's neighbor also said that she saw 2 people ringing her doorbell, but Natasha wasn't home. And then when Natasha got home the next day, she saw that there was just blood everywhere on her stoop at the front door. A lot of handmade bombs were thrown at the people from the Overcomers church. So things were now starting to kick off. And this must have been extremely frightening for the Overcomers, because I'm not sure if they knew who was doing it or if they just kept their mouths shut. But this sadly was the beginning of a lot of build-up. Then, in July 2012, the police were called to a double homicide in a security complex, where they identified 2 women to have been murdered, who were later identified as Natasha Berger, who was 33 at the time, and Joy Burnsier, who was 68 years old at the time. Both ladies had their throats cut, and the media initially jumped on the fact that they thought that it was part of some satanic ritual, because there were large amounts of blood everywhere. There were a lot of diagrams drawn with blood, and also nothing was really stolen. And just before the murders, Natasha did confide in her parents, and she said that she was getting a lot of threats because she was from the Overcomers Church. But she did say to her parents that she wasn't scared. She believed that she was going to be protected by God. Natasha Berger was an only child, and her parents were absolutely devastated by the murder of their daughter. Her mother was put on antidepressants, and her father got really, really ill after her murder. Joy Bunze, remember, was also part of the Overcomers Church, and she was Natasha's neighbor. So Marcel Stain was only 14 years old at the time of Joyce and Natasha's murders, and during the trial later on, she would testify that Cecilia had told Zach Valentine and his wife, Michaela Valentine, to murder these two women. Cecilia gave the reason for their murders the right thing to do because apparently Natasha had prayed a couple days before, and the prayer that Natasha had put out in the atmosphere had somehow caused numerous orphans to be murdered, and that is the reason that Natasha had to be punished. Now, I want you to keep the orphans and Cecilia, that link, very close in your mind because it comes up again later. So just to backtrack, Zach Valentine and Michaela Valentine were instructed by Cecilia to kill Natasha and Joyce because of their prayers and what their prayers had done, basically. So what had happened is Zach and Michaela had kind of staked out Natasha's house. They had watched her for a couple of weeks, and they noticed then her coming and going through the house. A couple days before Natasha's murder, they actually did try to gain entry to her house, and they knocked on her door pretending to be somebody else, and Natasha kind of felt that this was uncomfortable. She felt very unsafe, so she didn't open the door, and she just closed the blinds and she walked away. So Zach and Michaela were unable to get into the house, and they had to come up with another plan. So what they decided to do was they then walked over to Joyce's house, and they walked up with a massive present in their arms. They knocked on her door, and Joyce opened the door, and they said that they are friends of Natasha's, and they are just waiting for Natasha to get home because they want to give this massive present to her. So Joyce is absolutely loving this. She's so happy. She invites them in, and she lets them wait in her house for Natasha. But as soon as Michaela and Zach then get into Joyce's house, they tell Joyce to write on a piece of paper that Natasha needs to come to Joyce's house immediately. Joyce is obviously taken aback by this. She's scared, but Zach is now threatening her with a hammer. So Joyce writes on the piece of paper that Natasha needs to come immediately. Michaela then takes the piece of paper, she walks to Natasha's house, and she puts it under her door. And then she heads back into the house, and Zach then brutally murders Joyce. Once Natasha gets home, she then walks into her house. She sees the letter on the floor. She picks it up, she reads it, and she walks back to Joyce's house. As soon as Natasha enters Joyce's house, the two of them then attack Natasha, and they murder her right next to Joyce's body. They murder Natasha with a knife and a hammer. Then a couple months later, Reginald Ben Dixon, remember we spoke about him earlier, he was 75 years old at the time in 2012. He was a pastor, a singer, a songwriter, and he was an occasional guest speaker, and he occasionally did sermons as well in the Overcomers Church. Reginald was sadly found dead in August of 2012. He had been attacked in his home. He had been hacked to death. He had been stabbed in the throat, in the chest, in the legs. But the ultimate murder weapon and the cause of death was him being hacked to death by the axe. Reginald Ben Dixon was really loved by his community, and he was a loved father and grandfather. Marcel would again later testify in court that Cecilia had given Miranda and Zach instructions to murder Reginald. Cecilia had given both Miranda and Zach police uniforms that were from her husband's cupboard. So Zach and Miranda then went to Reginald's house. They rang the bell in their uniforms, and they waited for Reginald to answer. Zach then hits Reginald in the head with an axe, where he then obviously falls to the ground. Miranda then hops onto Reginald's body and starts absolutely stabbing him in the chest with a knife. The two then ran into their cars, and they drove away from the crime scene immediately. And later on in trial, Miranda would actually say that the reason that she killed Reginald was not because Cecilia had told her to, but because she felt that Rhea and Reginald were too close together. They were too close as friends, and that she felt that Reginald was very abusive towards Rhea, and that Miranda was just protecting Rhea. Now remember, Rhea and Reginald were very close friends, and Reginald was Rhea's mentor. So the day of Reginald's funeral, Rhea actually received a package on her doorstep, and she opened the package and she actually found a massive piece of meat in there, and there was a note on the box that said, "Now you can have your own little piece of Reggie." Then on the 4th of October 2012, an estate agent named Estelle Skitter was asked to meet Zach Valentine at his house. So Estelle arrives earlier than Zach. She's waiting there, he's late, and she kind of sees Zach kind of running up to the house. He then lets both of them in, and he's walking through the garage to get into the main house, and he starts calling for Michaela, his wife. Michaela doesn't answer, so Zach then walks up to the bedroom, and he then asks Estelle to just wait in the lounge. He'll be back right now. So as Zach is then walking up to their bedroom, Estelle then hears Zach shouting, "Oh no, Leafy, oh no, Leafy." So Estelle now hears Zach shouting, and she runs straight upstairs, and she then sees that the room is absolutely pitch black. It's so dark in there. Estelle then asks Zach to open up the curtains, and when Zach opens the curtains, she then sees Michaela Valentine tucked into her bed, but with blood everywhere. And I'm talking on the ceilings, on the bed, on the floor. And there's not only blood, there's also pieces of her body lying on the floor and on the ceiling. Michaela was absolutely covered in stab wounds and covered in blood. Police also thought that this was maybe linked to a satanic ritual, because not only are the mass amounts of blood, but there was biblical writing on the wall. The estate agent would say that Zach was eerily calm. He was kind of more focused on if the cats are okay, where are the cats, have they been hurt? So he was running around trying to find the cats. And then he kind of walked up to Estelle, the estate agent, after the police had been there. And he's like, "So we can still sell the house, right? Are you, like, what's happening?" So in the trial, after everything had happened, Marcel actually explained exactly what happened the day of Michaela's murder.
What led to Michaela being killed?
The fact that she wanted to withdraw from the group.
And then who came up with the plan to murder Michaela?
It was Cecilia.
And this murder was particularly difficult for Marcel to talk about because Michaela and Marcel were pretty close. Michaela would often spend time teaching Marcel how to cook, how to do her hair, just things like that. But basically Marcel would say that she and her mother were both at the crime scene and that they were given instructions by Cecilia to murder Michaela because after the 3 previous murders, Michaela started distancing herself, and she said to Zach in confidence, because he's her husband, that she doesn't really want to be involved anymore and she's scared and she just doesn't want a part of anything. And Cecilia felt that Michaela was now becoming a loose string, so they kind of needed to get rid of Michaela. Michaela and Zach had also given all of their savings, which included 2 million rand, to Cecilia. And remember I told you to keep Cecilia and the orphanage close in your mind because it's linked. And the reason why it's linked is because Cecilia would constantly tell the people of her group that Cecilia actually owned an orphanage for Satanists. So basically she believed that every Satanist would have to give up their first child. They would have to sacrifice their firstborn. And a lot of couples, Cecilia said, did not want to sacrifice their first child. So instead of murdering them, they would give up their child to this orphanage that Cecilia owned. And Cecilia was constantly trying to get money to sustain this orphanage, and that's why people kept giving her the money. So back to Michaela. So like I said, Miranda and Marcel were on the premises when Michaela was murdered, and basically the night before, Zach had given Michaela a lot of sleeping pills. He ground it up and put it in her coffee, so she was out like a light. She slept through the entire night, and she also didn't wake up the next morning, but she was still alive. So they planned that Zach would definitely have to go to work so that he had an alibi and to make sure that he was gone from the scene completely so there were no ties. And once he left, he would leave the door open and Miranda and Marcel would then enter the premises where they then continued to murder Michaela. Marcel explains that her mom, Miranda, walked up the stairs to where Michaela was sleeping and she then kind of taps Michaela, but she wanted to make sure that Michaela was very much asleep and would not wake up. So Miranda then proceeded to hit Michaela on the head with an axe a couple of times. And because of the constant jolting from this axe, Michaela did start to wake up. So Miranda panicked and she started absolutely pounding this hammer all over Michaela's face, completely disfiguring her. Miranda then took the knife and she started stabbing Michaela in the chest. And then Miranda kind of looks at Marcel and she's like, "Come on." So Marcel did admit that she did stab Michaela in the side of her torso. Then she pulled out the knife and said that she can't anymore. Her knife is too blunt. She actually just didn't want to be involved in this at all. She said it was absolutely horrific. But she said that she had to participate. Otherwise, if Miranda went back to Cecilia and told Cecilia that Marcel didn't participate at all, she knew that she would be in trouble. So those were all the victims of 2012. But Cecilia apparently wasn't satisfied with her rampage of revenge because she wanted to hurt Ria even more. and she went so far as to try and kill Ria's son. But luckily for Ria's son and for Ria, this plan actually fell apart and they couldn't get someone to murder Ria's son on the day. The group then decided to lay low for another 3 years until 2015. So now in this Electus per Dies group, Marcel, Miranda, LaRue, Cecilia, and Zach. But now in 2015, they started to now recruit another man. His name was John Barnard. John Barnard worked as a printer, and I think that he became part of this group because he was friends with Cecilia. Now, because 3 years afterwards, obviously all of this money has gone to the orphanage apparently, and they've now run out of money. So now the group is desperate for more. And because John Barnard works in the printing industry, he said he has the perfect next victims for their crimes. So he selected the next targets as Joan Mayer, who was 47 years old at the time, and Peter Mayer, who was 51 years old at the time. So Joan and Peter were actually John Barnard's employer, and they had employed him for many years. But Joan and John also not only owned their own printing business, but they also now bought a plot of land, and this was in KwaZulu-Natal. And with this plot of land, they decided that they were going to try and build South Africa's largest water park. Joan and Peter were described as really good friends, and they were described as really fantastic people by everyone that they knew. Then on the 27th of November 2015, police and community watch members were called to the residence of Peter and Joan, where the couple were found beaten and stabbed to death. There was no forced entry and only cell phones were taken and a little bit of cash that was on the counter. And just before the murder of Joan and Peter, Zach and Miranda were actually told by Cecilia to pose as government workers who were interested in knowing more about the water park that they were talking about. So Zach and Miranda were then invited to Joan and Peter's house, where they said that they would then cook them dinner. So Zach and Miranda then rock up at Peter's house, and they say, oh, there's no smell of food cooking, what's happening? I thought you invited us here for supper. And Peter and Joan said, oh yeah, you are for supper, but because it's Friday, we decided we were just going to get something quick from the shop. So our son has quickly gone to get takeaways. So Miranda was now worried that their son could come back at any time. So they then decided, unfortunately, murder Joan and Peter now before their son returned. Miranda then stood up and she pulled out the gun that she had in her waistband and then took cable ties out of her pocket. She tied their hands and their feet together. And then while she was asking them for the code to the safe, Zach started to go absolutely crazy and he started to stab Joan and Peter and he actually murdered them. And Miranda said that she was actually really scared of Zach at that point, but nevertheless, she carried on. She searched through Peter's pocket and she found a key. And they then went into the bedroom where the safe was, and Miranda then saw that there was absolutely nothing in the safe. So now the group still had no money and they needed to come up with a plan really quickly. So they decided that they were going to take out a life insurance policy for Zach. And this life insurance policy would be worth over 3 million rand. But Zach was still alive and kicking, and without a dead body, you can't exactly claim a life insurance policy. So sadly, they did need a body, and that unfortunately would be the body of Jared Jackson. Jared Jackson was 44 years old at the time of his murder, and he was a recovering drug addict. He had just gotten clean, and he was actually helping his newly pregnant wife to build a business. They were selling sweets near the train station, so they were really trying to build up their life anywhere they could. Zach thought that Jared looked just enough like him that they could probably get away with it. And Zach and Jared were somehow friends, and Zach then said to Jared, let's go for a drive. So they then got into Zach's BMW, and Miranda followed them in another vehicle quite closely behind. But before Zach went on this drive with Jared, he actually crushed up a lot of sleeping pills, and he then put it in some coke, which he then gave to Jared. Jared was kind of getting sleepy, and Zach then decided to pull over. And as he pulled over, LaRue then jumped into the back of the car. He then put a cable over Jared's neck and he started strangling him to death. They then pulled Jared into the driver's seat of the car. The car rolled off the side of the street. 3 of them then poured paraffin all over the car. They set the car alight and they all drove away. So they tried to make it look like Zach was on his way to the Free State and he got into a horrible car accident, or he fell asleep at the wheel of a car and he was now gone. So Jared's wife, remember, she was pregnant. She called Cecilia because she knew that they were all going on a drive. And Cecilia said, oh, I haven't seen Jared in quite a while. He didn't even get in the car with Zach. And then while Jared's wife was kind of trying to get information about her husband, Cecilia then put a stop to it and she's like, but you know, Zach got into a car accident. He's in a coma. So the police and Discovery did their investigations and they found that the body in the car was not Zach's body because the blood type didn't match Zach's blood type. So Discovery was told not to pay out the claim until they did a proper investigation because something was quite suspicious. Even though the blood didn't match Zach's body, he was still given a death certificate and he was legally dead. And you might be asking, okay, but where is Zach? And apparently he thought that he was going to get paid out for this massive life insurance policy. So he waited until Cecilia gave him the cue, but the cue never came because the money never came. So Zach then really laid low, but he actually had no money. So he was technically homeless. He was living on the street and no one saw him for quite a while. The group was now becoming desperate, and with the year 2016 knocking on their door, the group decided they needed a new tactic and a new way of getting income. So they decided now that they're no longer going to murder people that they know. They're only going to look for people that are professionals and that have no link to them at all. So they started this rampage with a man named Glenn McGregor, who was 57 years old at the time. Glenn was a self-employed accountant and he lived in Krugersdorp. Marcel would later testify in court that Miranda apparently made an appointment with Glenn to talk about her finances. So Marcel, Miranda, and LaRue went to Glenn's house to talk about the finances. And as soon as they're all in, they're sitting on the couch. Miranda then gets up and shoots Glenn in the stomach. He's stumbling over, he's now lying on the floor, and LaRue then gets up and he then takes a cord and he starts strangling Glenn. Miranda and LaRue then pick up Glenn and they put his body in a bath where they then fill the bath with boiling hot water because they thought that this would then destroy the evidence. Now, the weirdest part of this particular crime is that Miranda then transferred money from Glenn's account because just before he died, they did manage to get his account number and everything out of him. And Miranda managed to transfer 6,000 Rand into her bank account. And the reference that she used when transferring the money, she referenced it as sexy time or hot sex or something like that, because she said that in his apartment he had so many nude pictures and she thought that he was that type of guy that would be creepy in that way. The next body to be found was the body of 64-year-old Anthony Schofield. Anthony was found in the boot of his car in May 2016. Anthony had been wrapped in a lot of black bags and placed in the boot. Anthony had a lot of head injuries as well as the cable was still around his neck, which was determined to be the cause of death. And just like Glenn, Miranda made an appointment with Anthony Schofield and they decided to meet at Key West Shopping Mall. But just before they were supposed to meet, LaRue then called up Anthony to say, oh, can you actually meet us at our flat? Weren't able to get to the mall. And the reason that LaRue said that he does this is because in case they write in their diary who and when they're meeting, then it won't technically be linked to them because they never went to Key West or they never went to this other particular place. Anthony then arrives at the flat where he's greeted by Miranda. Miranda then says to Anthony, you can have a seat, I'll get you some coffee. And surprise, surprise, Miranda didn't get the coffee. She walks into the lounge after locking the front door. She pulls out a 38 caliber revolver and she tells Anthony to lie down on the floor and to give his bank pin, which he does. LaRue then leaves the house. He withdraws the money. Then he returns and he strangles Anthony to death. The next victim is named Kevin McAlpine, who's 29 years old at the time. Kevin McAlpine had just been married for over a year and his wife Kezia was pregnant at the time with their son. Kevin's murder was almost identical to Anthony Schofield's murder in the fact that he was lured to the house, he was strangled to death, and he was asked for his pin as well. Just like Anthony Schofield's murder, they also wrapped up Kevin McAlpine's body and they put him in the boot of a car as well, and they left his body in Krugersdorp city center. The car was later discovered by the police and Kevin's body was still in the boot, and they then had to make the horrific phone call to Kezia, Kevin's wife, to tell her that her husband had passed away. And 2 months after Kevin's murder, Kezia did give birth to their son. The group's final victim was a real estate agent in Krugersdorp named Haneli Latachan. Haneli was 52 years old at the time of her murder, and she and her husband had been married for 33 years. And on the day of Haneli's murder, her husband actually received an SMS notification on his cell phone saying that 3,000 Rand had been withdrawn from their bank account. And he immediately called Haneli, who wasn't answering, and he knew that something was wrong because he kept getting SMS notifications that there was insufficient funds and he knew that someone was trying to withdraw money from their account. Haneli's husband did report her missing to the police and there was a missing person report put out. However, her body was found the next day by school children who were walking to school and they found her body in a grassy area right next to the road. So the community of Krugersdorp was pissed off, to say the least. They wanted these murders to be solved because it was just getting worse and worse. So police were now hunting for anyone that they could link to the Krugersdorp murders. And when reviewing the ATM footage of the people who had been murdered, they actually found footage of Marcel and LaRue. They then brought in Marcel and LaRue, and at first they were really disobedient. They weren't listening to police at all, until one day, police officers went to LaRue's mom's work. Remember, Miranda was a school teacher, because they had been notified about Miranda changing her will all of a sudden. So police went to the school that Miranda worked. They had a look at the will, and they noticed that LaRue, Miranda's son, and Marcel were completely taken off the will altogether, and all the money that Miranda had in her life was said to be given to Cecilia. So police thought, okay, LaRue and Marcel aren't saying anything. Let's see what they say once I show them this will. So LaRue's now been taken into questioning because of these ATM withdrawals. He obviously denies anything about the ATM, but once police show this will to LaRue, he actually gets so upset and he's so heartbroken about what his mom had done that he's kind of like, screw her, I will say everything. So while they have LaRue and Marcel in custody, remember I said that Zach was homeless, and by a strange string of events, Zach was actually found to be homeless by this church community. So the church community brings Zach in with a whole lot of other homeless people, and they try and clothe them, they try and feed them, they try and give them something warm every night. And one of the ladies who run this church project, she goes home at night, she goes to her husband, and as she walks into her house, she notices this pile of documents on their dining room table, and she notices it because there's a picture of Zach right on the top of this pile. So the lady then looks to her husband and she's like, I know this guy. He's a homeless man who comes to get food from our church, and his name is Michael de Villiers. Her husband says, no, he's not Michael de Villiers, he's Zach Valentine, and he's wanted in suspicion of murder. The husband then says to her, you know, if you really think it's Zach Valentine, you need to prove it to me. And the wife is like, but how am I supposed to prove that it's Zach Valentine? And the husband says to her, see when you give him clothes next time if he has any tattoos on his back. And the husband goes on to describe what kind of tattoos she must look for. And then a couple days later, they're handing out clothes again at the church handout, and Zach is there. So the lady then walks up to Zach and she's like, here, try this on quickly. I want to see if it fits. And as he does, Zach turns and she sees all these tattoos at the back of Zach, and she notifies her husband, and they then go and arrest Zach. Now, like I said earlier, Marcel was very quiet. She was not interested in giving any testimony. But the more the trial was going on, the more she realized that yes, she was young when all of this went down. And she thought that what she was doing was right because Cecilia, her mom, and everyone she looked up to was saying that it's right. And as Marcel was listening to more and more of the families talking about their loved ones, she realized that what she had done was horrible and not right at all. And so that's when she decided to just tell everything and to spill the beans like her brother was doing as well.
Even though I didn't agree with what we had done and I felt that it was wrong, I kept on trying to convince myself that it must be right because Cecilia says it is. And if she is who she portrays herself to be, then she's right, and I'm listening to the devil when I'm doubting her. So when I got to the point that I realized that she isn't who she said she was, then I realized that what we had done was wrong. And there's no excuse for it.
John Barnard took a plea deal and he got 30 years in prison if he would testify against Cecilia, Miranda, and Zach. And he pled guilty to 5 counts of murder. In these court proceedings, you can see how aggro and how nonchalant Cecilia is, as well as Miranda, about everything that went down.
Never.
Did such orphanage exist?
I don't know of any orphanage.
It's a remote banking transfer of 2,100 rand into your account. The reference is Tinder.
Yes.
What does that mean?
That would mean thanks.
Being paid to you? Why?
That's just what she called it.
Who's that?
That would be Miranda.
Miranda paying tithe to you. Is that because you were running the ministry?
No.
And you can see that Miranda will defend Cecilia no matter what. And this group can only be described as predators. They murdered so many people out of greed and out of revenge. yes, Marcel was a baby when she did everything and she was kind of forced to do a lot of things. But the more that you learn about what she did, I don't know how badly I feel for Marcel. I think they all deserve their sentencing. And here's hoping that the younger people, such as LaRue and Marcel, do learn from this. And that is the case of the Krugersdorp killings. Let me know what you think down below. Please stay safe out there. Don't talk to strangers. And I'll see you again next week. Bye.